And the reason that we wrote this report is because we really wanted to expose how many real vacancies there were out there that weren't being talked about. And it happens not just obviously in Melbourne, but across Australia as a whole, and more so in speculative areas where investors don't see any advantage in investing for yield because the yields over here are so low. And the reason that they're so low is because we have tax policies that encourage speculation and therefore boost capital growth. And so our report is the only one like it in the world that looks at how many properties are vacant based on water usage data. There are a few other reports around the globe that do look at vacancies based on utilities, based on electricity and so forth. And since we've been writing it, we've just been amazed at how much publicity and attention that we've got, not just from the media, but also politicians, and not just in Australia, but across the globe, in New Zealand, in Asia, in England, in Israel. I took a trip to Israel last year, and there was a lot of interest in what we were doing over there. They judge their vacancies on water usage now in order to do tax policy. And so it's an interesting study in itself. The report is not perfect. We work very, very closely with water agencies to try and get the figures as close as we can to the number of vacancies. And I think this year we've pretty much done as close as we can get to finding an accurate figure. The inaccuracies Karl will talk you through as he goes through his presentation, but it is the most accurate recording of the number of vacancies that is available in Melbourne and in Australia as a whole. So just bear that in mind. It's impossible to do an absolute perfect representation. The reason that we're doing this report is really to try and get people to think about policy change and the consequences that we have in an economy that promotes speculation. And of course, a large number of vacancies are always give a little bit of uncertainty in a market that is promoted as being very strong. And I think obviously we've had a downturn in the real estate market, and the number of vacancies in any downturn usually get exposed because you see an increased number of properties come on the market for sale and market for rent whenever there's a little bit of economic uncertainty. Anyway, I will hand you over to the very capable Karl, and enjoy the evening.
Thank you, Catherine. All right, well, I'd like to start the night off by paying my respects to the traditional custodians, the Wurundjeri people. And I hope that by the end of this presentation, you'll see that the underpinning philosophy to the way Prosper Australia recognises resources and everyone's inherent right to them will build that bridge towards us all being custodians of the land. So Speculative Vacancies 9 started off on my bike way back in 2007. Well, even before that, 2005-06, there were huge headlines through the news. The REIV vacancy rate was at record lows and there was land supply shortages everywhere. It was an absolute crisis. And there I was cycling along, seeing vacant block after vacant block and scratching my head going, what can we do about this? And so the first report was counted on bike, myself and two other volunteers. And then luckily, a very smart volunteer of ours, Tom Curtis, suggested that we use water consumption. So it all began from a phone call through the customer service line of City West Water, and we started to access this data. So here we are some 12 years later, and something still doesn't add up. People they know something's wrong with the housing market, but there's a number of factors I'm going to point to tonight that hopefully will give you a new perspective on exactly what's missing and what we should be asking our governments to measure. Because we have these vacant rental properties that are advertised, but then there's these other hidden vacancies that don't get much publicity until our WE report comes along. So what is a speculative vacancy? It's a property that consumes less than 50 litres per day, averaged over 12 months by postcode. And the per person average was 161 litres a day, and per household was some 426 litres per day. So we feel that having a threshold that's somewhere between 1/3 to 1/8 of average consumption is a fairly good indicator of vacancy when we have so much aging infrastructure that leaks. And taps leak up to 50 litres a day. So an absolute vacancy is 0 litres consumed over 12 months. So yeah, that's one that really people can't argue with. You know, that is a vacancy. There's a little bit of a grey area whether the 50 litre measure is, you know, watertight, but we think it's a good indicator of vacancy, and hope that greater analysis is spent by this, by government, by policy wonks looking at our land usage. So our key findings this year, we found 60,901 residential properties that were speculative vacancies. So as a percentage of all residential property, that was 3.9%. And when we add that to the SQM vacancy rate of 3.3%, comes up at 7.2. So imagine what would happen if we had an unemployment rate for labour of 7.2%. There'd be an outcry. People would be really concerned to be the #1 policy priority of government. But alas, page 34 of the AFR today, we thought we were going to be front page. Didn't quite happen. They put the request in yesterday. Can you find an investor who owns property but is keeping it vacant? Get us that and your front cover. So we hit the phones, we tried everything. But if you're out there and that's you, please come and see me for next year's report. So, yeah, you just wonder, you know, how long this affordability crisis is going to continue. I really feel that we've had a paradigm change when it comes to housing. It's post-GFC, the world of commodification has accelerated greatly, and it's something that everyone who's struggling to pay their mortgage or to save up a deposit really should spend time studying, because I often say on my Renegade Economists podcast, how much economic pain can people take before they really want to study these rules of economic engagement? So many people say they want to be wealthy, but they don't understand how supply and demand works. The basics. The press, it's been all, as you know, real estate's everywhere. I love this headline, my Uber driver is a land speculator. A lot of this happened over the last year or two, and we'll get into why a bit later on. So today, the big headline number was that 16.2% of investor-owned rental properties were potentially vacant. So that was an analysis of the rental market only. So we looked into the time series analysis through the census, removed all the public housing and co-ops, and applied some equivalents to the total number of vacant properties we quantified, and 16.2% was the number there. So again, we're at these two extremes, somewhere around 7.2 to 16.2%. They're huge numbers, and people who are paying through the nose for somewhere to live really need to take this on board and start asking questions of their MPs. So these absolute vacancies, 1.3% of the residential market, 4.6% of the rental market. But if we remove that public housing, the co-ops, it only comes down by 0.1%. So we can see there the sort of market power that investors have. The co-ops and public housing sectors have suffered for many years of neglect, and it's great to see that a possible shortened government's going to do what they can to build that up. Also good to see what Daniel Andrews has done here in Victoria with a number of innovative planning type amendments to support the growth of ethical property. And I really think that's going to be a term we're going to hear more and more about, is the need for ethical property investors, ethical property companies who will hopefully share the rents, share the rising value of location back with their community, back with their people, a la the community land trusts. So yeah, a year and a half ago, we released a report called the Unspoken Alternatives to Expensive Housing that showed that by sharing these land rents, we can be 4 times more effective than the current paradigm of building more houses. So the runs are on the board, and we're waiting for the mainstream to really catch up. So it's really, you know, it's all there on the table. It's just a matter of getting the word out there. So yeah, when we add the SQM vacancies to the investor-owned property, that vacancy rate's up around 7.8%. So to spell out this this major oversight that when people hear of a vacancy rate of some 3%, the problem is it doesn't include these speculative vacancies. We're only hearing about these rental vacancies down here. What about these guys, which are often larger in size and impact than what we hear about? So it's time they were no longer ignored. We really need the ABS to start measuring these. So what about these shortcomings in real estate theory? Over this 12 years we've been doing this report, back in 2013, I think Philip Seuss wrote the Speculative Vacancies report, and he started prodding around going, now, come on, Real Estate Institute of Victoria, where does this 3% equilibrium rate come from you're talking about? That's supposedly where the forces of supply and demand are somewhat even, and we're in this point of equilibrium. Well, he's refused to leave the foyer of the REIV until one of their policy wonks will come out and answer him. You might see Philip on Twitter is one of the alternative economics world sort of superstars on Twitter. And back in those days, he was just wanted to get the bottom of it. And finally, someone came out and told him, look, there is actually no theoretical grounding for this 3% equilibrium rate. Stay with me, though, because we will reveal more when it comes to real estate theory. So the REIV's vacancy rate, even though there was no theoretical basis to it, guess how it was formulated? By a voluntary survey of real estate agents. So it's quite extraordinary. There was a huge bias there for them to only report in when they had record low vacancies. So, of course, that self-fulfilling prophecy helped to drive this demand for more land supply, which really most of you in the room will know is code for rezone my land, aka make me a millionaire. So it all slotted in quite nicely, one after the other, and no one was asking questions except for us. So over time, with all the press we've received through this report, the voluntary measure of the REIVs has pretty well taken a back seat. And these days, the mainstream media really quotes SQM, and they've got a much improved vacancy rate that data scrapes the advertised vacancies that are online, that have been online for over 3 weeks. And if you're not clearing that property within 3 weeks, it comes up on their vacancy radar, which is pretty reasonable if you ask me. Yes, Karl.
Can you describe SQM? I'm not familiar with that term. What do you mean?
SQM? Oh, goodness. I don't
It's a
know.
data agency in Sydney, which is run by a guy called Louis Christopher.
Yeah.
And he's an independent data collector, and so he uses his tools basically to. He's very good. If you ever, he gives away a lot of free property data, but he, I think, does the most accurate vacancy rate, and he does it based on properties that have been advertised for 3 weeks or more as a percentage of the investor-owned properties. And and actually he does have an explanation for 3% vacancy rate.
Right. Thank you.
So there's a missing factor. Let's see it another way. We have for lease properties, we have speculative vacancy, but unfortunately, we still don't have this accurate total vacancy rate. So it really doesn't add up when it comes to residential land and housing. So on to other shortcomings in real estate theory. What about inflation? It ignores the role of land. 2017, 2.1% inflation rate, but there were Melbourne house prices up by 15.7% according to CoreLogic. Just outrageous. And around that time, I interviewed Gareth Aird, who's a senior economist at the Commonwealth Bank. He puts out their research notes every month, and he'd done a whole paper on how land is ignored from the inflation rate. So pretty much they believe that because land is not consumed, it should not be part of the inflation rate, says the ABS. So in a way, they are recognizing that land is its own unique factor of production, but still we need to include it in our inflation so that an accurate cost of living can be calculated. And at the time, it was very interesting that the UK had also recognised that not including land in their inflation rate was a big concern. So they were being quite radical and including the land component within the basket of goods, and it represented 10% of a consumer's average consumption. Now, does anyone here have the luxury of paying just 10% on somewhere to live? You'd have to think it'd be 30% plus, wouldn't you? And so, there's another little aspect that covers up the incredibly powerful role of land and its utilization in our lives. And when that happens, we have record low inflation. So, of course, let's keep cutting interest rates to keep the bubble going. That was a poster I put out in about 2015 as the RBA was busy cutting interest rates. And this self-fulfilling prophecy of pushing real estate higher and higher post the GFC has really put policymakers in a bind now that they recognise they went too far. Now it's on the other way down and they haven't got much headroom to use monetary policy. Now, what about housing supply? This is a big one that we often talk about in our Speculative Vacancies report. And let's have a look at what's happened in Victoria. These are Victorian land values compared to dwelling starts since 1980. And we can have a look here in orange. Pretty much whenever there's an opportunity for affordability to be delivered, housing supply changes. And of course, being realistic, if you're a developer, it makes economic sense for that to occur. In 89, 90, you're not going to keep building to deliver lower land prices. Here we are in 2000, a lot of conjecture about the GST on housing and what it was going to do to the real estate market. Of course, they cut right back on supply, and then very quickly, once it was digested, supply kicked up again, oscillated along, and here we are in 2010 to 13, 14, and again, supply was knocked back. And look at the land price underneath there in grey, still continued onwards and upwards. So my point is that it's almost as if policymakers expect housing supply to remain pro-cyclical, to deliver on its affordability. But soon as the market shows any sign of correcting, rationally, they reduce the supply, and consumers, home buyers, are left on their knees trying to find some way towards affordability. So this whole housing supply philosophy needs a lot more analysis. And we're lucky that we have Dr. Cameron Murray up in Brisbane, pulling apart many aspects of this housing supply. He's written a paper this year called Marginal and Average Prices of Land Lots Should Not Be Equal. And this Glazer and Gaiocco model, you might have remembered last year a bit of a hoo-ha about a Reserve Bank of Australia paper that came out and said the big cause of housing affordability pressures in Australia is the lack of rezoning. That is our problem. And Cam has gone through this, I think it's a 1980s paper by Glazer and Gaiocco, and torn it to shreds. And basically he applied their rezoning hypothesis to land prices back in colonial Brisbane type era, a couple of other times way back when, before rezoning was really an issue, before it was part of the planning toolbox. And he found that prices still went up even without the supposed rezoning conditions. So there's a lot to dig into when it comes to real estate theory. And you think that it's our largest financial investment in our lives. And when you look under the hood, you start realizing that so many of the theoretical underpinnings are on incredibly shaky ground. So here's our top 20 residential. This year we had Box Hill up the top. Burwood, Brunswick West is a bit of a regular. Heidelberg's been a regular as well, but these eastern suburbs findings were something that I raised my eyebrows because I really hadn't seen that before. If we have a look at the map, we can see pretty much three cohorts we're going to talk about, but this line here is the vacant residential property tax boundary. This was a tax that was largely inspired by this report where Daniel Andrews in the Homes for All Victorians policy package in March 2017 announced that there would be a vacancy tax based on 1% vacancy tax based on the capital improved value of your home. So if the property was voluntarily called in as a vacant property, you would face this vacancy charge. So let's have a look, because it was quite interesting coming up with it. I've sort of found a few patterns through these vacancies, and we had three main categories of gentrification holdings, cultural attractors, and this one that really, can you believe this is uttered in public? Land banking in the path of development. Talk about impeding the market. This is a primary real estate speculative strategy to buy land and hold it and wait in the path of development. And you too can spend $2,000 to go to a seminar and hear someone tell you how to do that. It's incredible. So the gentrification holdings, Brunswick West, Northcote, Fairfield, Thornbury, Reservoir, McLeod, and better mention this guy. This is the guru behind tax minimisation for lawyers. Fantastic seminar. It's an advantage having a business, an NGO called Prosper Australia. Every now and again you get a call from some sort of spruiker thinking that we'd be up for what they're talking about. And there I was in the number 1 Collins Street hearing all of these land banking, all these property speculation strategies. So if you ever do get a chance to go to a Dimphner Boholt type seminar, go in and see what they're up to, because it's incredible, all of the loopholes that they work out. Now, one of the prevalent ones is called postcode hopping, where an investor can buy a new property and pretty much change their voting address and one phone bill to this new property, and then claim that as their primary residence and sell it in the 13th month with 0 capital gains tax. So we had some questions asked by Peter Wish-Wilson at Senate estimates recently regarding negative gearing, and there's a better watch out, property investors. There is a crackdown on negative gearing write-offs, and lo and behold, there's going to be 4,500 audits of investment properties this year, which equates to 0.015% of all investment properties. So, at the tax minimisation for lawyers seminars, the number one line was buy and wait until the cool crew turns up. Incredible. This was a film competition we ran back in about 2007 called the gentrification game, where artists set the scene and speculators wipe it clean. So, yeah, if we go into these gentrification holdings, we can pretty well see that these guys, Brunswick, Northcote, Fairfield and Thornbury, in the Triple R cohort, I sort of call them, throw a blanket around Triple R, and there's some 1,500 absolute vacancies there, 3,100 speculative vacancies. So somewhere within those two parameters, where the coolest people in Melbourne are listening to the coolest radio show in Melbourne, and they're being laughed at by these vacant properties that, they're pulling their hair out trying to find somewhere to live, but this is going on in their own backyard. Now, these suburbs, the Brunswick West, Reservoir, McLeod and Heidelberg, well, they're probably evolving markets where hipsters are being forced to, because the wannabes have moved in now to that first cohort. So you can kind of see a bit of a theory in the way these speculative vacancies are being held. There is some behavioural drivers underpinning these outcomes. Now, another cohort under the cultural attractors banner was out in Box Hill, these eastern suburbs properties. So we've got Box Hill, Burwood, Doncaster, Nunawading and Glen Waverley. I've got to be careful talking about this one, but yeah, selling Melbourne. It's all up for sale. But in those top three suburbs, residents born in the People's Republic of China represented those sort of percentages. So significant factors, and the questions we raised were, were family members buying real estate and holding them for other family members who were trying to get a residency here? Is that the role of many international students to be those sort of property scouts? Certainly plenty of anecdotal evidence around talking about those sort of factors. So again, there's some underpinning to why there are such extensive speculative vacancies there. There also has been quite a bit of building, as was pointed out in today's AFR article referencing our report. So what about this one, this land banking in the path of development? Craigieburn, Mernda, Broadmeadows, Epping, all up towards the north of the city. And this is where the savvy get busy and buy and wait for a good decade or two, hoping that their land gets rezoned and the property will go from an $800,000 investment to a $20 million return, as a la one of the, what's the bikie gang, Comancheroos? Comancheroos, one of those head honchos is in on this game as well. This is a website in California where you can read about your roads to riches through land banking. So, you hear all these things about the free market and the beauty of neoliberalism and how the pricing system directs behaviour to allocate resources to their best uses. But again, look in under the hood, and this is a huge driver for these vacancies. So we raise that as an issue that everyday people really need to latch onto and start asking questions. Is this the sort of economy we want? Is that the sort of equality of opportunity, a fair go mate? All of these sort of concepts come through when you hear this concept of making people basically beg because you own these property rights and they can't do anything about it. So commercial vacancies. This one's, always a little bit higher, the commercial vacancies, 9.1% across all suburbs. The top 10 had 20% vacancy rate, whereas the average of the top 20 fell down to 13.5%. Now, what's the theoretical underpinnings to the commercial vacancy rate usually being higher than the residential? Well, it's the lock-in effect of rents. For anyone wondering how you should calculate the amount of money you should bid on a property, have a look at an equivalent property in the same area and the rents that are being charged there. Multiply that by 20 years, and that will give you a ballpark figure of what that property is worth. So here is this building we're sitting in now. This was taken before we bought the property. But if they had have tried to drop the rents on this property, the value, the asking price for this location would have fallen. So it's actually better for them to keep it empty and try to extort the market to pay their asking price. So that's why commercial vacancies are usually higher than residential. And it's been quite shocking to see some of the numbers that have come through. Again, Box Hill was another high point for vacancies in the commercial setting. So what about banking constraints? This is a big issue for developers who have large land banks, and banks really don't like developers dropping their asking prices, because if that bank has lent them millions of dollars, that then implies that they have to write down their books as well. So that is a big concern. And if you happen to read over here this book, The Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking by Philip Anderson, you'll see in there an incredible chapter about what happened in America between 2005 and 6, 7. No, it must have been 2006 to 8. And he quantifies in there the number of small and medium-sized banks in America that collapsed because they had to write down the value of the loans they had outstanding because land prices had started falling in the first quarter of 2006. So it took 30 months from that peak of the land price in America to wipe out all these small and medium-sized banks, all the way through to Lehman Brothers, September 17, 2007. Well, that was 2008. And everyone piled onto it at that point, some 30 months after the land prices had started constraining credit and filtering its way through the US economy. So here we are. Just recently, I was up near Maryvale, that one of those new big wonderful suburbs. Some family made $300 million having their land rezoned up there before they sold it. But here we have the developer Satterley, who is not dropping his price, but once you pay, you get a $15,000 thank you check. So the bank doesn't have to write down the value of the assets. So the market is constrained again. We can't get an accurate pricing floor because of behaviours like this. So I just wish that at this time in the post-Royal Commission into banking, that we had greater leverage to ask questions on the banking system to allow for greater fluidity in the pricing of land and real estate in a falling market. Because after all, they make so much money out of rising land and housing prices that when they're really needed, they should allow these prices to find their natural equilibrium. So what about our vacancies over time? Here we see it from 2009 up to today. You'll note that in 2010-11, arguably the depths of the GFC for Melbourne, our vacancy rate started to really jump. That was the year it was up to 90,000. And we felt that that was, again, part of this underpinning speculative behaviour of savvy investors buying at the market low and holding properties out of the market. Whereas since our last report in using 2014 data, now in 2017, we feel that quite an element of profit taking has undertaken over that time. And because of that, overall speculative vacancies have fallen. So this market power, really, you know, that's what we're talking about here when it comes to vacancies and their underreporting. We need to understand how that impeding of the market manufactures scarcity in a way. That's the term I use. You know, when vacancies aren't put on the market, it manufactures additional scarcity, putting a base under that pricing floor and pushing it higher or keeping it higher than it really should be. And, you know, when you see vacant lots like this in the inner west of Melbourne, this was around Braybrook, where I lived for a decade and near where we did our first ever study. You know, these sites sat empty for 5-6 years, you know, incredible stuff. So here at Prosper Australia, we are strong believers in something called the 18-year property cycle. And this is something that Fred Harrison, whose book The Power and the Land is up there, and also Philip Anderson talk about. But if you have a look at the 18-year property cycle, there's some 216 months, and this cycle has been shown time and time again to have a 7-year increase, a 2-year mid-cycle correction, and then another 7-year boom, followed by another 2-year correction. So if we take it that, say, some 36 months out of those 216 are where buyers have some market power, such as now, we can see that the sellers really have control of the market for 84% of the time. And that's a huge market dominance, just looking at the time basis of it, let alone any of the other benefits that come from record population, from record infrastructure spends, from record access to easy credit, to you know, this situation where there is tax incentive after tax incentive for property speculation and very little understanding of this market power that's enjoyed. So our friends in the UK have produced this incredible graph you'll see in the report, which really sums up again part of this misinformation that we need to really get a handle on. And this blue line is the cumulative number of rezonings over time. The orange is the number of housing starts. So they're the two basics there. Look at that cumulative number of plots. It is incredible. And because of the power of this graph and, you know, housing activists recognizing this market power developers have in the UK, the Tories, of all people, announced an inquiry into UK build-out rates. Now, the head of this inquiry has a rather unfortunate name, Sir Oliver Letwin. And when I show you this next graph, the inquiry revealed that the biggest, I think it was 10 developers, had a build-out rate of 6.5% of their estate each year. So I graphed that, and it turns out if 100% land supply in your new master planned estate, 6.5% takes 70 years to complete. Now, there's another example of market power. I'm sure the developments don't get much longer than 20 to 30 years, but we're hearing more and more stories of developers after complaining about this lack of land supply based on this record low vacancy rate, then turning around and bragging to their investors that they're going to take 35 years to drip feed this estate. Stockland is the latest one to do that. If you ever get a chance to go for a drive through Manor Lakes out near Wyndham, Dennis Family Homes is up to stage 175. And they're barely halfway, I think about 40% through their land bank. So no one's asking these questions. You know, Richard Pratt got done for meeting with some guys to talk about the price of cardboard boxes, ridiculed and, you know, his name in tatters. But here we have these outstanding citizens who are all major donors to the political parties, able to do this in broad daylight. And we need to ask these questions. So, onto the home stretch, our recommendations. As I've hinted in the report, we met with the ABS, Catherine and I, a year and a half ago, talking about the need for them to take on this measurement of vacancy. You know, we're just a small NGO. We'd love to see the powers of government investigating how vacancy can be quantified. We also met with the State Revenue Office when the vacant residential property tax was announced, and they wanted our insights on water consumption and what could be done to help reveal these vacant properties. So it's good that government at some level is interested in what we're doing, but it's now time to take the next step. So what about this vacant residential property tax? In the report, we recommend that boundary that's stuck within the inner and middle rings where the vacancy tax is applied be extended out to all of Greater Melbourne within the urban growth boundary, because you'll read in the report that the price of land in Melbourne's outer west increased by 41% between the announcement of the vacant residential property tax and 12 months later. 41% increase in land prices out there. So, we know that tax incentives drive behaviour. So government, let's get savvy. Let's get on the front foot. Let's not allow this to continue. So we also believe that one of the problems with the CIV-based taxation of vacancy is that, in a way, it gives land banks a discount. Vacant properties or vacant homes would pay more than the land banker who's knocked down the house that was on that property. And this is one of those driving concerns we have through our council rate system. The same principles exist, where we tax the land and buildings. So speculators who are planning to hold a site empty for 5 to 7 years will just knock down the old weatherboard house. What was once affordable rental is now gone. They also get a council rating discount over time, and we're all worse off. Now, how about this one? I wonder if this is going to get any George's thinking, because this is something that's I've been sliding into a few of our reports recently, and that is that some sort of, whether it's a land tax or this vacant residential property tax, that it increases over time. The longer it's vacant, the higher the land tax rate would be. And from that, the greater the penalty for being lazy. Why not? You think about unemployed labor, you find 20 job applications this week. What does the land speculator have to do? Move from one ski resort to the next. There's no pressure at all on them. And we have to turn this whole behavior around of how we treat the land. And this other one, Vancouver, has been outstanding in the way they've implemented their vacancy tax there. Before it was announced, actually went to the people, got their buy-in, said, what would you spend this money on? We're going to raise serious money here. What would you do? Did the outreach, got everyone on board, prepped them up. Property lobby came in, tried to squash it. No chance at all because they'd done the public education. This is a real problem that we find here at Prosper. We try to talk about tax reform and people's eyes kind of, they glaze over a little bit, but when they put two and two together and see all the ramifications, it slowly builds up the importance of what we're talking about. But we'd love some assistance from government to be able to educate people in a greater detail. So in Vancouver, they have a $10,000 a day fine if you are busted for not declaring your property vacant. So it's serious stuff. And of course, there's been quite a lot of vacancies revealed. Here in Victoria, it's voluntary, and the budgetary numbers are hidden under one line item after another. So we don't really know what's happening. It's going to be very interesting having a look at next month's budget figures on that front. So the big one, of course, for us here is to reform state land tax so that we can replace stamp duties. We have a big report coming up with Tim Helm here in the audience. So, that is the big next step that's needed. When you think about the vacancy tax, they're having to use a number of different surveillance measures to detect whether a property is vacant or not. If we just have a land tax in place, none of that sort of behaviour is required. Everyone will contribute, and from it we'll see a raft of spin-offs such as greater contributions towards our infrastructure. We'll see we'll see a drop in housing prices to some extent. We'll also see greater intergenerational equity. So that really is the big one, because in a way, part of this reframing of what a land tax is that it's a thank you payment for living in a community. We say thanks. Those who live next to the nature would pay a little bit more. We'll have employment, we'll have public services, we'll have infrastructure, we'll have the benefits of location. So when we start paying back the community for that, rather than being penalised for working, we believe it will make society a lot fairer and a lot saner. The social contract is falling down because deep down people just don't get why they're penalised for working when someone can go and get the golden pen tick on their land. And there's Paul Little, former Essendon chairman, making some $40 million in 18 months by flipping a property down in Fisherman's Bend. Wouldn't we all love that? Well, what about the people who buy the apartments on that location? That $40 million is now being paid off by 150 first home buyers. So, we need to look to the depths of things, and that's where understanding this land game, understanding the way vacancy interacts with the property cycle, we can recognise the sort of easy profits that are made in real estate. And when so many people have been up in arms about the banking sector of recent, nationally, the banking profits were at $54 billion in up till 16, 17. But Victorian land prices increased by $189 billion that 1 year. So we're comparing national banking profits to Victorian land values. The Australian land values increased by $660 billion at the peak of the bubble. So that $660 billion is going to end up in greater mortgage debt, more inequality, and all those bells and whistles. So thank you. Hopefully you can support our work by sharing it online. Who knows? Maybe someone will donate. We have memberships, and once you've been a member for a while, we'd love your help on the executive. We also produce the Progress magazine, and anyone who'd like to sign up for a few complimentary copies, we can send them out to you to build up your understanding of this old story. So thank you very much. Okay, any questions?
Adding the Louis Christopher data, the square metre, SQM or whatever they call themselves, to our vacancy rates, couldn't there be a bit of double counting in that effort? Why are they discrete and separate files?
Well, because our vacancy rate is over 12 months. So the rental market generally turns over quite a bit faster than that. So we're pretty confident there's not much double counting there. We can't say that's exclusive, but in the report you'll see there's a table 1 lists 17 different biases, both upwards and downwards, that we recognise can influence our findings. So we're trying to be as objective as we can, but we'd like to think that, for example, some of these big commercial sites that are vacant, plenty of residential land banks as well, have one water meter that will be rezoned into 3/30 dwellings when that rezoning comes through. So there's a bit of offsetting in that sort of manner as well. Yep.
Have you noticed many houses and properties being demolished because of this new tax here in Melbourne?
I haven't. I must admit now I live outside of the city and I'm not cycling around as much anymore. It's harder for me to keep an eye on what's happening on that front. But we'd be interesting to see if that has had an effect. It's a pretty minimal charge, though, 1%, $5,000 a year. But I imagine it would provide some sort of spur to speculative investors.
You mentioned the contacts you have with the ABS. Has there been any developments from that initiative, really?
A lot of that was to do with the census and trying to improve the census findings there. But it must be time we knocked on their door again and said, here's our latest report. Let's keep the pressure on with that one, because the nature of housing has changed well and truly, hasn't it? And we have to recognise that through government policy, through the way we measure underutilisation.
Do you have any sense of how well the government's doing in administering the new tax, as in compliance efforts, to investigations to try and uncover people that are failing to self-declare? Has the SRO been publicising anything?
Have not heard anything on that front, have we? There's been no leaks. There's been nothing at all. I'm hoping we'll get to meet with SRO following this report. We're trying to organise a meeting with the water bodies as well to bring them along with this story, because it seems that governments, New South Wales, Queensland as well, are looking at vacancy detection. They've got their own various vacancy taxes as well. So you know, it's something that's here to come. You know, it's here to stay, sort of thing. And you know, we've seen various academics talking about the use of Wi-Fi. Maybe that's a way to discover vacancy. But we still feel that water is the best one because you cannot change billing providers. You know, if you're in the location that Yarra Valley Water provides to, they're your billers, and that's that's who you're with. So there's no data fragmentation, if you like, because of that.
Just got another question as well. I might have missed this earlier. Of the 90,000 odd vacant, do you have a sense of how many are built properties, such as apartments in Box Hill, sitting completely vacant versus vacant lots that haven't been built on? Or...
Yeah, I really wish we had that sort of qualitative data. We, because of the Privacy Act, we only get postcode specific data levels averaged over time. So we can't point to any one particular vacant property that turns up in our findings. But out of the 61,000, let's call it vacant properties, 21,000 use 0 litres of water. So we're not sure how many of those we could attribute to vacant lots. We also know that Victoria's water infrastructure is ageing, and we wonder whether that has a downward bias on some of our findings in eastern suburbs, if you like, that have been around for a longer time, where there are greater underground leaking water pipes. It's a pity that Vic Water doesn't release the non-revenue water consumption, which quantifies those leakages. So I had to look back to a 2003 PowerPoint that was given in Shepparton at an engineers conference to find out about, you know, the new technologies that were there back then. I just wonder what is possible now, and it would be great if we had a greater depth of detail, because of course water body will tell us what the flush factor was on AFL grand final day, which grand final was the most riveting according to the flush factor. But we cannot understand how, you know, whether, for example, you know, Docklands used to have 30% vacancy rates there. Have people put in automated water meters there? You know, I don't really want to spy on people, but it would be nice to know if at 2 o'clock every day someone's wasting, you know, 50 litres of water. You know, maybe it's just the Airbnb effect that's come through. So it's a lot of changes that are happening in the marketplace, and government needs to be on the front foot there.
When you say here impeding the market, as a valuer, I've often thought, what am I really valuing? Is this a real market? I think in many ways it's a faux market, because unless there's, in what other market? I mean, if I grow tomatoes, I can't sit on them for the next 10 years. I'm not. If I've got iPhones, you know, that'll go out of date pretty quickly. But there is no market unless you've got some incentivising thing. So I've often thought as a valuer, what the hell am I really valuing here? I'm valuing a market price, but is it real? Is it a so-called market price, but is it real value? You know, it's got the only market that's not a genuine market in my opinion.
Isn't it a giant Ponzi scheme?
Well, that's right, yeah. And when you say people are doing this on the, you know, they're getting in the development corridors, well, who wouldn't if you get the opportunity? Because all the laws encourage it. You know, the tax system encourages
the market
it.
tells you, doesn't it?
Right.
So at one stage I was tweeting that, you know, that really this housing supply mantra is the last stand of trickle-down economics.
Yeah, that's all
And
really, isn't it? Yeah.
It's incredible what people like Cameron Murray are doing, you know, and other academics around the world really looking into this real estate theory and recognizing how much of it has been distorted. Here at Prosper, of course, we are all over the transition from classical economics to neoclassical, where pretty much land was removed from the core economic function to become a subset of capital, as if capital already owned the earth way back in the 1880s. So, more and more layers of distortion are continuing. And I commend you for coming out on this night and seeing our ninth report into vacancy. Let's hope we don't have to do them for much longer. Let's hope there is an incredible ethical awakening of people in recognizing that making money through property flipping, through rezoning windfall gains, they're not valid market activities, and government would do well by taxing them away. The next question we're going to have is whether we do that via capital gains or land taxes, and we'll leave that to Tim Helm's upcoming report to touch on that. So thank you very much. Please join us for some drinks and nibbles.
Hey, how you going?
Yeah, some interesting, yeah.